Hi, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on pre-employment transition services, program planning, and set-aside determination. We're so happy to have you with us today. This content is jointly funded and developed by the Vocational Rehabilitation Technical Assistance Center on Quality Management and the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the collaborative. And the information here doesn't necessarily reflect the position or policies of the Department of Education, nor should it be construed as an endorsement. We want to welcome you to this presentation. I'm Melissa Deal, and I'll invite Julia to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Julia Doyle.
And we'll be your hostesses with the mostesses today. And today we're going to just walk through what we're hoping to review with you all, which includes a clarification that this is more than just a fiscal exercise. So last year, we revised the guide for state vocational rehabilitation agencies to determine whether they've met the requirements to reserve the pre-employment transition services funds that are required to meet the needs of all students with disabilities needing pre-employment transition services, required and coordination activities, and to determine if the agency can pay for any additional authorized pre-employment transition services from those reserve funds. This presentation, we're going to highlight some of those key features in the guide and more. One of the main points that we're going to hope you walk away with is that this is more than just a once a year fiscal exercise. It should be an ongoing activity to kind of plan, execute, monitor, adjust, the whole rinse and repeat, right? We're going to dispel myths that we've put in this presentation that we hear often throughout our work with state vocational rehabilitation agencies. We're going to review some of the key elements from that reserve set-aside determination guide, as well as some key elements from our strategic planning guide and how all of these things work in concert. We're going to review the effect of carryover, reallotment, relinquished, and matched non-federal funds on the pre-employment transition service reservation requirement. And we're going to discuss who should be at the table and the process and procedures that need to be carried out and how you tell your story.
So to start off, like Missy said, we're looking at this is more than just a fiscal exercise. We really want to have a feel at the end of the day of the agency's ability to effectively spend those federal funds necessary. We're going to be having conversations, discussing who is going to be responsible, what you need to do, what processes you have to have in place. What do you have to do to document it all of those people that have to be at the table, because really, absent of a clearly designed written process that is outlining the scope of services being provided, who they're being provided to, your rate setting methodology for those services, your average cost of services, your process for determining when you're going to tap into those authorized funds, your process determining when you're going to turn off the funding. Absent of any of those written processes, VR agencies are just not effectively able to anticipate or forecast where they are in the provision of pre-employment transition services to all students. And they're not going to feel confident in their ability to effectively spend funds in the reservation requirement, whether those authorized are allowed or they can tap into them or not. So, what is our first myth? An agency must wait until all students with disabilities receive pre-employment transition services before they can tap into those authorized. I remember when I was in RSA, we used to hear this a lot, and it's supposed to be a fluid process. There's no requirement that you wait until every single student that could potentially receive services in a year have come in before you can start looking at what those authorized services are and if you could tap into them. You do need to make sure that you know what you are required to provide services under those required services to all students. If every single student came in the door that could potentially need services, you should know what that amount of funds are. But once you've determined that, then you can start looking at those authorized services. And one of the things that we hear a lot is, well, I know I have this total amount that I'm supposed to reserve from my federal award allotment, so I'm going to set aside 15%, but then I get another federal allotment in that carryover year. So do I calculate it on each federal fiscal year, or is it a holistic amount of what I have in a given year? So it's determining the total amount of funds that might be spent on required services based on what you have in allotment that year and what you might have still access to in that carryover year.
Yeah, and I know you talk a lot, Julia, about ensuring that the state knows that they met those carryover requirements, so they know they indeed have those for that additional year, right?
Mm-hmm. We do get into how do you know if I've met carryover a little bit, but those are more, I think we discussed that in some previous webinars.
Yep. So that brings us to myth number 2, which we hear quite often, that the minimum 15% reservation requirement is a static number based on federal funds that are allotted in that original grant award notification for the federal fiscal year. But in reality, and one of the things that we do highlight in that reserve set aside determination guide, and we'll say more than one time here today, is that that number is based on the lesser of the maximum amount of federal VR funds that are matched, or the amount of the net federal VR award at the end of the period of performance. So if you walk away with nothing else today, we'll help you understand that you can't look at this once at the beginning of the fiscal year when you get that first grant award notification, because it definitely is not a static number. That minimum reservation amount is going to be based on the lesser of those two things. And we're going to talk about in a few moments what that net federal VR award means. And Julia's going to go through that. But this is also described again in that guide.
So one of the things I wanted to highlight though, before we get into it, is that minimum reserve requirement is actually similar to what maintenance of effort or matches. It's a state level requirement. Because I think a lot of times VR agencies know what they are required to reserve and expend. But it's really, as Missy said, the lesser of those two items that are that affect what you have to reserve and set aside, but that's at the state level. So it's really the maximum amount of federal VR funds matched by the state, especially if there are more than one agency in a state, like a blind and a general agency, or the state's total federal net award amount at the end of the period of performance. And so as a VR agency, if there are more than one of VR agencies in a state, I need to coordinate with my other partner agency, because I can't effectively monitor what I am spending and putting aside unless I'm coordinating that with my state partner.
Thanks, Julia. So we promised, you might have asked yourself, what do we mean by net award amount? So the net award amount accounts for changes due to reallotment, if you relinquish any funds, if you have any maintenance of effort reductions, and any other federal award amount adjustments. So it would also include transfers if there are two agencies in a state, blind and a general, and maybe one agency transfers funds to the other. But that's not going to affect your minimum reserve requirement, since that is a state requirement. But it does affect what your net award amount is as an agency. So we just wanted to kind of make that clarification.
So let's go through some examples of how you know what your net award amount is. I'm going to start with the easiest first. So the first one is there's no adjustments whatsoever. I'm a VR agency and I receive $1 million and I fully match my $1 million and I don't participate in any reallotment. I don't relinquish anything and I don't get any transfers. So my net award amount is the total of the federal funds that I have received. So that's $1 million. So as a result, my 15% is calculated on that 1 million. So that would be 150,000. And then again, I'm assuming in this example that the non-federal share was met as a state. But what if I give up money in reallotment? So in this instance, I'm a VR agency again. I think we're going to use this $1 million because it's a really easy example. Assuming you make $1 million, you get $1 million, maybe you get more as a state agency, probably do. But we're going to say that you get $1 million. However, you give up, that's the allotment process, you give up $25,000 during that reallotment period. And now again, I'm assuming I've fully matched everything, but I've still given up some. So my remaining federal award, that net award amount, is the 1 million minus the 25,000 that I gave up. So that's 975,000. So as a result, my minimum amount to be reserved for PREETs is based on 15% of 975,000, which in this instance is 146,250. I love numbers. Instead of giving up money and relinquishing it, we're gonna give an example where I receive funds in reallotment. And again, I'm making the assumption that I have fully matched all the federal money that I have received. So I've received $1 million in my initial federal award. However, in the reallotment process, I asked and received an additional $25,000 in federal funds. So now my net award is that 1 million plus the 25,000. So it's 1,025,000. And then again, assuming they were matched, the new minimum reserve is the 15% of the 1,025,000. So that amounts to 153,750.
So that brings us to myth number 3, which kind of recaps what we talked about a few slides ago when it comes to states where there are 2 VR agencies. But we do hear often where states with blind and general agencies that each of them have calculated their own minimum reservation requirement based on their own grant award notification. And what we're trying to make sure that you fully understand after listening to this webinar today is that that reservation and expenditure requirement for pre-employment transition services is a statewide requirement. Under 34 CFR 361.60, that's the reference where it talks about just like match is a statewide requirement. And so those certain conditions, if there are 2 agencies where maybe one agency doesn't fully match their grant award and the other agency overmatches, if each agency were to only look at what they were matching based on their own grant award, they might incorrectly calculate what their state's reservation requirement is.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Missy. And the GAN attachments actually address on it a little bit. This has been language that's in the GAN attachments since WIOA was signed. And it really highlights the importance of working together. So it says, while it might be helpful for VR agencies, especially with a state that has 2, to reserve and expend at least 15% of its own allotment, there's no statutory requirement that it be done. So if one agency uses more of its funds than the other, the state would be in compliance so long as that total 15% is met at a state level. So that kind of touches on what Missy is saying, is in an instance where there's 2 VR agencies, if one of them maybe spends more and one of them spends less than that minimum amount of 15%, as a state, so long as it's 15% of that state net award amount, they would be.
Thanks, Julia. So let's walk through a few examples calculating the effect of matched funds on the reservation requirement for pre-employment transition services. And I think you have a few examples for us with different scenarios.
I have a lot of examples because of course it's not just a one and done. There's so many things that you have to consider. So first, I'm going to look at it as if I'm a combined agency and I have not fully matched my federal award. So in this instance, we're going to use that easy $1 million. I'm a combined agency and I've received $1 million. And this includes whatever it is in reallotment or whatever. We're just saying your net award amount is 1 million. So in order to be able to fully access and draw down and obligate and expend that full $1 million, I need to provide $270,648 in non-federal share. So that's looking at that 21.3% of the non-federal share. However, as a combined agency in this instance, I'm only able to provide $250,000 in non-federal expenditures. So I didn't fully meet the match required to draw down that 1 million. So as a result, I've only actually matched $923,709. And so that's all I can spend down and spend. That's all I can draw down and spend because that's all I've matched. So in this instance, the minimum amount changes because it's based on what I was only able to match. And that's 15% of that $923,709, which amounts to my 15% being $138,556. I would say in that instance, again, just keep in mind if that for that past one, if the agency was fully matched, they'd have to reserve and expend that 150,000, but because they didn't, they're only required to reserve and expend what they actually matched. All right, so the next example, really, that first one we gave, that was an easy one. Now we're going to get into what happens if you're a blind in a general agency in a state. So like we had mentioned before, it's a state requirement. So it's calculated at the state level in addition to the agency level. So I still need to know what I'm required to. And I should still be conducting my own fiscal analysis, but you really should know or be coordinating or planning or discussing what you're doing at the state level because it affects if you've met that minimum amount reserved as a state. All right, so the easiest example, if I am a blind in a general agency, is if we've both met our match. So in this instance, we each receive $1 million. So the blind and the general agency both get $1 million each, which means the state's allotment is $2 million. And in this instance, nobody gave anything up. Nobody asked for anything else. They've just gotten that $2 million. So what I'm required to reserve and expend, because I fully matched it, is 15% of 2 million. So that's the 300,000. Each VR agency would reserve and expend at least 150,000, which would be 15% of 1 million. And now this is when it gets fun and tricky. So we're a blind in a general agency and one of us did not fully match our grant award. But the answer to how do I calculate and reserve what is the state requirement is based on, well, what did the other agency do? So we're going to say that, again, we're a blind and general agency and we each receive $1 million. And the blind agency, instead of being able to fully match the grant award, and we've already talked about what they need to fully match it for that 1 million, instead of that 270,000 plus, they were only able to provide 200,000 in federal and non-federal share. So they were not then able to fully match that federal award. However, the general agency matched to the dollar. So they spent exactly 270,648 in non-federal funds, which means they can fully draw down that federal award. So in this instance, the blind agency's minimum requirement is based on the federal portion that the blind agency was able to match. Okay, so the general agency matched to the dollar, right? So they were able to fully draw down their grant award because they matched it exactly. And the general and the blind age, I'm sorry, the general agency fully matched, and the blind agency didn't quite. And so the blind agency is now 15% of what they were able to match. So instead of it being the 150,000, it's now $110,845. So the state total is the combination of those two, that 150,000 for the general agency, and then the 110,845 for the blind. Okay, now I'm a blind agency and I didn't fully match my grant award. But what happens if the general agency overmatched its? So instead of the general agency matching to the dollar of what's required for their federal share, they were able to spend additional non-federal funds above and beyond what's required for their federal award. And many agencies do this. So in this instance, I'm going to say the general agency spent more than that $270,648 that was required. They actually spent $341,296. And we'll get into what that means in federal in a second. But again, the blind agency was only able to provide and spend that $200,000. So the blind agency did not fully match their grant award. So we look at the state total again. So we have that 2 million, right? So we have the 2 million being the 1 million to the blind agency and 1 million to the general agency. But what were they able to match as a state? The blind agency only provided that 200,000 in non-federal share as match, but the general agency, they overmatched. So they provided that 341,296, which means as a state, their match, their non-federal share they were able to provide was 541,296, which means they fully met as a state the federal requirement for those federal funds. So even though it's the general agency's funds, the general agency still overmatched. And so the federal allotment that was matched is that full 2 million because the general agency provided extra. And so they actually were able to cover what the blind agency's portion of in non-federal funds that the blind agency wasn't able to provide. And so now the federal amount, again, it's that $2 million that was matched. So that's the 15% of that. So instead of it being what the blind agency was only able to match and just that 15% that the general agency matched of their full allotment, the minimum pre-employment reserve requirement is that 300,000. It's 15% of 2 million because the general agency overmatched.
I think this example is so important if you're a blind in a general agency in a state, because I think so often this is what's getting missed in determining what that minimum reserve as a state is. And then that discussion that has to take place between the blind and general agency about how are we going to meet that state's minimum reserve? What are we going to base that on?
Well, right. And I will add, Missy, actually, if you wanted to go back, this is critical because as a general agency, you know, I'm not required to spend, it's a minimum of 15%, but as a general agency, I mean, I can still spend that minimum 15%, but I'm not required to spend on pre-employment based on what, those additional federal funds, right? My number as a general agency still stays at no less than 15% of my federal allotment. And so if the general agency isn't going to spend more than their minimum amount of 15%, and the blind agency thinks that they only have to spend 15% of what they matched, as a state, you're going to fall short.
Yeah. And I think, what that all boils down to for me is that when we think about who's responsible, since it's a state requirement, you both are, right? And
Yeah, right, yeah.
yeah, so RSA isn't gonna, for instance, say, oh, you're the one that fell short, or you're the one that fell short. They're gonna say, hey, state, blind and
Mhm.
general agency, you fell short in meeting the state minimum reservation requirement. What are you going to do next time? Or
Right, and it's a little different than a maintenance of effort assessment, because if there's maintenance of effort assessment, if one agency is short, the state still has a maintenance of effort, but really the only one that's affected is the agency that had the maintenance of effort assessment against them. And in this instance, if you don't meet that 15%, you as a state do not meet that 15%. So you really have to coordinate between the two of you.
yeah, for sure. All right. So next we're going to look at calculating the effect of unused funds that remain at the end of the period of performance on the pre-employment transition services requirement. So we have some more examples.
This one is really fun. I just love all of these examples. I'm a fiscal person. I love them. Okay, so we're going to start with the easy. I mean, it's not really easy, but it's easier. So I'm a combined agency and I have matched funds that I didn't end up spending. So I get $1 million, again, my federal award amount. And in order to be able to draw down and spend that $1 million, I provided $270,648 in non-federal share. However, I didn't fully spend my grant award. So at the end of the grant award, I have $100,000 left over. So what does that mean for me? Well, the minimum amount reserve that's required to reserve is still based on what I was able to match. So because I still fully matched that $1 million, my 15% is still based on that $1 million, even though I have 100,000 that was left at the end. So that's still 150,000 that I was required to reserve and spend on pre-employment transition services. But it's really important. Do not expend more than 85% on VR services that are not pre-ETS. And so if I am not going to spend my grant award amount, and I say, hey, I'm going to have 100,000 left over, no matter where you are, I would just caution you, do not spend more than 85% of your federal net award amount on VR services that are not pre-ETS. Now we have a somewhat easy example as well. So I've got a combined agency and I get $1 million, but I didn't fully match my grant award. So instead of providing the full grant award amount, instead of providing the full non-federal share amount for that 1 million, again, I was only able to provide 250,000. So that means I had a little less in federal money than the full award amount. So I have that $923,709. In addition, I left $100,000 unused at the end of the period of performance. And so I got $1 million. I didn't fully match the $1 million. And I had 100,000 left over. What would my minimum amount required that's required to be reserved based on? Well, it's based on that 15% of what I've matched. So that's 15% of that 923,709, which would be in this instance 138,566, because $23,709 of the unspent 100,000 was matched by the agency. It really makes a difference if you match those federal funds or not, because part of the requirement is that you reserve and expend that 15%. And so if I didn't match it, then I really didn't have it available to reserve.
So now that we've walked through all of these different scenarios and situations, how do we tell the story, right? How do we understand and how do we put this in writing, to really understand the impact and tell our story?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider as you think through how your story is told, because your story is really only as good as you can document or as you can show, right? And that's one of the reasons why case review processes and quality assurance and DALA validation and contract monitoring, it's one of the reasons those are also important. Because unless you know where you are, then you don't know if you can tap into that authorized authority. And you won't know if you do tap into those authorized services, if maybe you need to pause or stop those authorized activities due to an increase in what you need to provide in those required pre-employment transition services. You really need to know all of these factors. How you're providing the services, what is the mechanism that you're using to provide those services? Are they provided by staff? Are they provided by contracts? How do you measure what it is you're providing? Do you have data? Are you looking at the services? Are you looking at the students? Can you look at any given point in time where you are in the provision of those services? Do you know what it would take you as an agency to tap into those authorized? Are you telling your story in the RSA 911, the RSA 17? Sometimes states think that if it's not in the RSA 911 as a reported service, then it's not, you can't capture it as a pre-ex expenditure, but you can. There are other costs for pre-employment transition services. And so how do I know that I am telling my story fully based on all of the data that I have available?
Thanks, Julia. So part of telling the story is understanding those key factors in that story so that we understand how that story is constantly evolving and changing, right? That's basically what we're trying to kind of communicate today. And those components are also in the pre-employment determination set-aside guides. We're just going to highlight some of those here today, and just kind of first starting with how do you know and how many students with disabilities are in your state that could potentially need pre-employment transition services. So that includes students who may apply for and be determined eligible for pre-employment transition services, but it also may be those students who choose to just receive pre-employment transition services as a potentially eligible student. So a lot of times your state education agency is going to be the best source of that information. A lot of our VR agencies ask their state education agency for the number of students in special education. It's difficult sometimes to get the number of students who are receiving services under Section 504, but many agencies attempt to get that information as well. Other agencies use other data provided by local education agencies to get estimates. However you do that, you're just wanting to get as true and accurate picture as possible of how many students with disabilities are in your state that potentially could need pre-employment transition services. Next, we got to describe how the agency is going to ensure that all of the students with disabilities in your state and their families are aware of the availability of pre-employment transition services statewide. So this includes, how does your agency make those 5 required services available in the state, whether that's through your own agency staff or that's through contracted providers. VR and its local education partners have to work together to ensure that those services are coordinated and sequenced with their respective regulatory requirements. So IDEA, for example, provides very similar transition services, but they're doing that under IDEA, right? And we are providing pre-employment transition services under the Rehabilitation Act, authorized under WIOA. All right. Next, our process should include how we calculate the cost for the provision of the required pre-employment transition services required activities and those 4 coordination activities that are most often carried out by our staff. So this should include, at a minimum, all of those non-administrative costs for those required activities, the cost for the pre-employment transition coordination activities, costs for the provision of required pre-employment transition services through third-party cooperative arrangements. And it's important to differentiate the cost for pre-employment transition services from other VR services that might be included in those third-party cooperative arrangements if you have more than just pre-employment transition services in those TCPAs. You're also going to provide or include the cost for pre-employment transition services that are through other agency contracts and agreements that you might have. Also, the cost of any auxiliary aids or services, as well as those additional VR services that may be charged to the reserve consistent with the notice of interpretation. And then, for most agencies, they're going to then calculate an average cost per student to start to identify and forecast what the cost of services is.
And Missy, can I add to this? One of the things I think that's important is in the regs, it says the cost of arranging for the provision of services. And so sometimes when states are determining what that cost is, they forget about those additional costs that are necessary for the arrangement of the provision of the direct service. So make sure that you're not leaving that cost out as well.
That's a great point, Julia. So that brings us to myth number 4. States can decide whether or not to document and allocate staff time on additional services that can be charged to the reserve based on that notice of interpretation. So hopefully everyone knows what we're talking about when we talk about that. But in February of 2020, RSA first issued this notice of interpretation. And then in March of 2022, they finalized that notice of interpretation that kind of clarified both the use of auxiliary aids and services and other VR services for eligible students with disabilities that could be charged to the reserve when necessary in order for that student to access and participate in pre-employment transition services. So we hear quite often states will say, well, that's too much work. We're not charging staff time. It's not that much money anyways. So we're not going to do that. And one of the things we just want to clarify is that that's really not an option. So as an agency, you're required to accurately determine the authority in which you're able to expend funds. So you have to document and report those things accurately. So if that time is spent on those activities and they should be charged to the reserve, then that's how you have to document it. Sorry, Julia.
And I would add to part of your process should identify this, right? And so if some of those additional activities that are allowable to be charged to the reserve that are in that notice of interpretation, if they're being provided to a student, pre-employment transition services, in association with the provision of pre-employment transition services, or an individual who's not a student receiving pre-employment transition services, my policies should be in place so that staff know which one I'm going to allocate it to. Because there are requirements in, everybody loves CFR 200 that require grantees to, have internal controls that determine how they're going to document and how they're going to demonstrate that they've maintained those requirements. And the other thing I just wanted to highlight is into CFR 200 under personnel costs under 430. It talks about how charges to federal awards for salaries and wages must support the full distribution of wage that the employee works on, and that it must be consistently applied. And so whatever methodology you use, it has to be consistently applied and it has to fully document that staff time in it.
Thanks, Julia. And the other part of this myth that we just wanted to kind of make special note of that we hear often is that once a state has expended 15%, they stop reporting those expenditures. And that again, is not an option, because part of that accurate reporting means including all of the expenditures for pre-employment transition services, even if it's going to exceed 15%. And so just so you know, a big red flag for states when they go to report on the RSA 17 is if they're spending magically to the penny, right? 15% on pre-employment transition services. It would be very rare that you would get to the penny your expenditures on pre-employment transition services without going somewhat over or under at some point.
And rare to do it year after year. But in light of what we had mentioned earlier, this even becomes so much more critical if I'm a blind or a general agency, because now if I'm a general agency and maybe I am spending more than that 15%, I need to report that full 15%. I mean, I already have to, but I really should be, and I'm required to. And then maybe that will help that blind agency if they didn't fully match it or spend it. So,
and just as Julia was describing, you know, how no matter what, you cannot spend more than 85% of your funds on VR services other than pre-employment transition services. And so when you factor in the staff time you may or may not be capturing, we also want to remind you of how important it is for these other costs from the notice of interpretation, because that also should get factored into your forecast in how you know how much it's going to cost to reserve and expend for the required and coordination activities, because these additional costs and services factor into your forecast to determine then what you have remaining that may be spent on authorized activities. So just a reminder, that's those auxiliary aids and services that could be needed by a potentially eligible or VR eligible student with a disability with a sensory communicative impairment to participate in pre-employment transition services, as well as any additional VR services that are needed by a VR eligible student with a disability who's under an approved individualized plan for employment to participate in one of or more of those required activities. All right. So going back to our process for determining our availability of reserve funds for authorized activities, we want to calculate the amount of our minimum reserved funds that must be set aside for the provision of required pre-employment transition activities, as well as those coordinated activities. That's going to tell us then, do we have funds that remain that we've reserved for one or more of those 9 authorized activities?
and remember, you have 2 grant awards that might potentially be available in that exact same year. And so that includes looking at, what do I have from this federal award allotment in this fiscal year? Plus, what do I still have left from carryover? So make sure that you're using both grant awards when you're figuring that out.
So next we're going to talk about who needs to be at the table, right? Because just like we said before, this can't be something you do once a year, right at the start of the federal fiscal year, and then you put it on a shelf somewhere because you looked at that original grant award notification. And we also don't want it to be just your fiscal person, or just the person who does your financial reporting. It can't be just the VR director and the person who does your financial reporting, right? We need to have a variety of key personnel who each are looking at this from a different lens to fully understand how you're doing and where you are at any given point in time. So we want you to consider things like regularly scheduled leadership meetings where you have members of fiscal, your data. They often get left out of these key conversations, but they have the numbers. They know who you're serving and who you're not, right? They know what services are being provided and which ones are not, right? We also want your transition and other program staff at the table as well. They're often left out of the conversation, even though they get the charge to go spend the money. They often don't understand when maybe you've decided to relinquish funds or get reallotment, or you haven't matched your funds, and that all is going to push and pull different levers to
And
determine.
they can tell you too, if more students are coming in or they're seeing more, or maybe they're not seeing as many. So they can tell you where you are with the pulse of the actual students that you're serving at any given point in time.
Ideally, you're going to do this each and every fiscal year on an annual basis, but then you're going to have regularly scheduled meetings. Maybe it's monthly, maybe it's quarterly. We probably would recommend no less than quarterly, but you're going to want to often meet, and everybody's going to want to understand, this happened, and now that impacts this number, and what are we going to do? So that question of, are we going to spend our minimum reservation requirement becomes, how are we going to spend our 15% minimum reserve? It shouldn't be a what or a if, it should be a how, right? So other stakeholders that we're going to want to involve and be part of the conversation at some point that are going to give input should be counselors, supervisors, your rehab assistants, other central office team folks, maybe your financial officers, members of your executive team, your SRC could give input, maybe the DSA or a commission if you are part of an independent commission, as well as other providers and stakeholders.
That's a great segue, Missy, into, okay, now we've brought people at the table. Now what do we need to do? And so part of it is having a process in place. And this process is what we use to evaluate where we are in our expenditure of funds, because ultimately processes and procedures, they mean nothing if you don't know if they're working for you and if you're meeting the intended outcome. So you need something written down, and you need to have a process to look at it to continually evaluate where you are in your spending levels. And those processes could include a myriad of things. We wrote a couple of examples. They include ensuring that you're paying reasonable costs for those required services. So that's your rate setting methodology, right? Like, are they reasonable? Are you looking at it? Do you ensure those services are necessary? Are you just throwing services at a student? Are you looking at, is this what they actually need? Are the amount of funds that are expended, do you know what you're spending? Do you know what you're obligating? Especially if you have contracts. So a lot of times states don't have a handle of what they've actually obligated under contracts for students receiving that. So do you know? Do you know what that cost is that you've already spent, or what you promised to spend for services? Do you know the amount of funds reserved necessary to provide services to all those students who may need them? How much funds do you have remaining? What do you do if you have funds remaining? Are we going to tap into those authorized activities? If we do, what type of authorized activities are we going to do? And how do we know that they're actually going to improve the program? Have we done some type of evaluation, or are we just throwing money at an authorized activity? Or do we think it's something that's going to improve the provision of pre-employment transition services to our students? And then again, looking at those authorized, are those reasonable? Do I have a rate setting methodology? Are the costs I'm associating with those authorized activities necessary? Do I have a process to determine what's an authorized activity versus what's an admin cost? Sometimes that line's kind of blurry, right? So do I have something that I know as a VR agency, what I'm going to consider is an admin cost, or what I'm going to consider as an authorized cost? Do I have a plan for implementation? Does everybody know what we're going to do if we're going to do those authorized activities? What if every single student comes in and all of a sudden I need to pause those authorized activities because now I need to go back to my required, right? So I know I'm doing good and I'm not spending all of the required, but I've set it aside. So I'm starting to spend some authorized, but oh no, everybody's coming in. And now I need to put a pause on those authorized activities. Does everybody at the table know what that actually would look like? Meaning, do I have a communication process, internal to my own staff and external to those providers, about how the agency is providing those services, how we're doing the coordinated, how we're doing the required, how we're doing those authorized? And if something happens, do I have a process to determine when additional non-reserve funds might be used? We'll get into that a little later, but do I have a process to know if I want to keep spending it, maybe I don't have reserve funds, how do I do that? How do I navigate within my state?
All right. So the next thing that we want to talk about is reviewing and updating that process, right? So we talked about at a minimum, it should be reviewed annually, right? To begin with, that's your baseline. That's where we want you to start from, but that's just what it is. It's just a starting point for which then you're going to evaluate and measure throughout the year consistently and on a regular basis. So agencies that charge pre-employment transition services authorized activities to the funds required to be reserved and expended for pre-employment transition services, you're responsible for ensuring that you're using available data to support your decision-making process. And because the data elements used to calculate that amount to be reserved and expended, we want you to analyze that and update that regularly when there's any unanticipated changes in the total amount of federal expenditures expected to be charged to the federal fiscal year. So just kind of what we were talking about. You have that expectation, but then that doesn't actually always come to fruition.
Using non-reserve and non-federal funds, there are times where maybe a VR agency is not able to assign costs to one of those authorized activities. So like we said, sometimes maybe all these students come in, right? And let's say I'm getting, I'm spending my 15%, but I also have these authorized activities. And so, and it's, maybe it's not funds remaining and available for use, but I have these authorized activities and I don't want to stop them. Right. And so how do I know if how I'm going to continue to provide them, right? What's that process that I have? Am I going to decide to spend non-federal funds? Am I going to use, my match funds for it? Am I going to spend non-reserved VR funds? Again, things have to be consistent, right? And so like we had talked earlier, things have to be consistently applied. And so in order to do that, I have to have a process and I have to know what that process is before I start doing it. And so if you have an example or a process that says, in this instance, this is the funds we're going to have, and this is what we're going to do if these services have to be spent with this non-federal funds or non-reserve VR funds. And so I think it's important that everybody understand what that means, because fiscal staff will have to know if this is the scenario, then I've got to switch over the obligation and the expenditure to this other source of funds. And so everybody has to be at the table to know, what do we do? When can we use those non-federal funds? If we still want to spend those expenditures and obligate them, right? But it's not going to count towards our reserve.
And I think what you're talking about also kind of highlights just why we're talking about this determination and use of and forecasting of the reservation requirement, but it is a subset, right, of the larger, what is your overall forecast and spending plan, and how does this fit in, so that if you even have those additional funds.
Do I have those non-federal? Right. Yeah, exactly. Do I have additional VR federal, or am I on an order and I'm struggling to serve, those who meet the criteria of my order?
Yep.
I like this slide a lot, because there are so many times I hear states say, I haven't even thought about the authorized activities yet. But the thing I think that the key critical thing to remember is that these authorized activities are not ongoing commitments. Right? It's supposed to be used to enhance and improve the provision of pre-employment transition services. So it's really a strategy that you can use as a VR agency, especially a VR agency that's struggling to fully spend that 15%. There's these great 9 authorized activities that can really help you supplement and improve what you're doing under those required activities to students. And it's really meant to be a fluid process between those two. It's a plan to improve the service delivery. It's a plan to build capacity. Maybe some of those activities are actually already occurring but you haven't considered if you can start spending authorized yet. And so you don't actually know that you're doing enough. And if you are, they're not being counted towards the reserve because you haven't done your forecasting. But there's a lot of states that I would say probably are spending stuff under the authorized, spending it with VR funds because they don't realize that it actually is some of those authorized activities. Because again, it's that determination, right? So I know what I need to set aside, and I know that maybe I'm not hitting it. Am I supplementing with those additional authorized activities? I think, and I can never say this enough, it is so important to have a strong rate setting methodology. And there are so many reasons you need to make a rate setting methodology, but part of it is to make sure that you're not spending unreasonable or unnecessary costs, right? So that you know that what you're spending is providing good services, it's good bang for your buck, and these students are getting what they need, because you do not want to be spending too much on a potential service or a potential activity. And a part of that includes strong rate setting methodologies and contract monitoring. So one of the things Missy mentioned earlier is like, if I promise, that I'm gonna, probably pay this contractor up to $300,000, am I looking at it? Do I know where I am in that? Do I have a not to exceed amount? Am I looking at the per cost per service per student? Do I know what my actual expenditures are versus what I said, I might potentially authorize under that, but not just expenditures. But do I know what my obligations are? So do I know what services are actually already being provided under this contract? And if I do all of these things and I'm looking at these contracts, then I can determine if additional programs, or different projects, maybe they need to be implemented to supplement or improve what I'm already doing.
Yep. All right. So why is this all so complicated? One of the things
it just is
all the time, right? We have our monthly office hours, and every month, folks, why is this so complicated? But they just are, right? Those authorized activities, though, just as Julia was saying, are meant to enhance the provision of pre-employment transition services.
Yeah, they're really supposed to supplement those required ones and build capacity and increase overall service delivery. I think it's a critical piece of pre-employment transition services that's being missed.
And, if we leave you with nothing else, please feel free. We're here to help support you all. If you have a question, or we can direct you to a resource, or we can walk through something with you, we are happy to help. So you can contact us directly. You can email us, you can call us, you can request technical assistance through the transitionta.org website. You can contact us through the Vocational Rehabilitation Technical Assistance Center and Quality Management website. And you can certainly reach out, and we encourage you to do so, to your RSA state liaison and fiscal management specialist. And that's all, folks. We have some great resources at the end of this PowerPoint slide deck. We're also going to be providing with this PowerPoint handout a separate handout that just has all of those examples for you if you want to walk through those separately. And again, thanks for joining.